5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
How many times could you fly to the moon with the money spent on one war? That's not a rhetorical question. The numbers are public, they're verifiable, and they're large enough to be almost impossible to picture until you put them side by side. In roughly 4 years, one government spent somewhere between $200 and over $500 billion fighting a war. In a similar span of time, another organization spent under $100 billion building the infrastructure to put humans back on the moon for the first time in 50 years. Same order of magnitude, completely different outcome. This is a story about what the same amount of money can build or destroy, and about a country that 60 years ago was winning the most ambitious technological race in human history, and today struggles to keep up with a single private company. Let's start with what it actually costs to go back to the moon. NASA's Artemis program, the modern successor to Apollo, has cost somewhere between $93 and $100 billion, according to NASA's own Inspector General. That's spread across more than a decade of development. Where does that money go? The Space Launch System, the rocket, alone, cost over $23 billion to develop. The Orion crew capsule, over $17 billion. Add the lunar lander, the Gateway space station, ground systems, testing, and you get to that $100 billion figure. One single Artemis launch, rocket and capsule together, costs around $4.1 billion. That's the most powerful crewed rocket built since the Saturn V that took Apollo astronauts to the moon in the 1960s. Expensive? Absolutely, but it's also a number with a ceiling. A known, finite, auditable amount of money that produces something that will exist. Hardware, infrastructure, capability, for decades. Now compare that to what a private company built with less government money and more commercial discipline. SpaceX's Starlink, the satellite internet constellation, generated $7.7 billion in revenue in 2024. By 2025, that had more than doubled to $11.4 billion. 61% of SpaceX's total sales that year, and projections put 2026 revenue as high as $15.5 billion. A single Falcon 9 launch cost around $67 million. Compare that to government-built rockets costing hundreds of millions per launch, and you start to see why SpaceX dominates commercial space right now. Over 10,000 Starlink satellites are currently in orbit, serving more than 10 million subscribers worldwide, including notably providing emergency internet connectivity to Ukraine after a Russian cyber attack knocked out satellite internet across the country at the start of the 2022 invasion. This isn't charity, it's a profitable business, but it illustrates something important. With a fraction of the money spent on a modern war, you can build a self-sustaining global communications network from scratch. Now, the harder numbers. According to Site3, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, widely considered the most rigorous source on global military spending, Russia's defense budget tells a clear story. 2021, the year before the full-scale invasion, $66 billion. 2022, the first year of war, it jumps to $102 billion. 2023, $109 billion. 2024, a sharp rise to $149 billion. And early estimates for 2025 suggest it climbed even higher. Add those years together, and Russia's military spending since the invasion totals somewhere in the range of $400 to over $500 billion, depending on which methodology you use. To put that range in context, the US Defense Secretary offered a more conservative estimate in late 2024.
Meanwhile, Russia has paid a staggering price for Putin's folly. Russia has suffered at least 700,000 casualties since February 2022. It squandered more than $200 billion.
Rand Corporation's narrower definition of direct military costs puts the 2022 through 2024 figure closer to $132 billion. The exact number is genuinely contested. Russia doesn't publish transparent budget data, and estimates vary by what's counted as war spending versus broader defense spending. But every credible source agrees on the trend. The curve only goes up. War spending isn't a one-sided ledger. The country being invaded pays a different, in some ways heavier price. As of December 2025, direct physical damage to Ukraine, buildings, infrastructure, energy systems, exceeds $195 billion. The full cost of reconstruction and recovery over the next decade is estimated at nearly $588 billion. That's almost 3 times Ukraine's entire pre-war annual economic output. 14% of all housing in the country has been damaged or destroyed. Over 3 million households have been displaced or directly affected. By 2025, a single day of fighting the war cost Ukraine, on average, $172 million, up 23% from the year before. Multiply that by 365 days, and you start to understand why Ukraine's defense budget alone hit a record $71 billion last year. The European Union and the United States have together contributed more than $300 billion in military and budgetary support since 2022, though that burden has shifted dramatically. After a change in US administration in early 2025, American support dropped by 99%.
And it will take me no longer than 1 day.
I will end that war in 1 day. It'll take 24 hours.
I would get a settlement in 24 hours.
Europe absorbed the difference, increasing its own contribution by roughly 2/3 to keep total support stable. So, let's put these numbers next to each other. At the conservative end, the US Defense Secretary's estimate of around $200 billion in Russian war spending. That's already enough to fund 2 complete Artemis programs with billions left over. At the higher end of Cyprus' estimates, over $500 billion, that's 5 full Artemis programs, or roughly 35 times the size of Russia's entire annual space budget as of 2016. This isn't a literal accounting exercise. Military budgets and space programs operate under completely different economics, different timelines, different political constraints. You can't simply redirect a war budget into a moon mission overnight. But the comparison illustrates something real. Resources that flow toward destruction are resources that don't flow toward anything that outlasts the conflict. A moon landing leaves behind data, technology, trained engineers, infrastructure that other programs build on for decades. A war, win or lose, mostly leaves behind debt, casualties, and things that need to be rebuilt. Here's where the story gets genuinely surprising, even for people who think they know this history. In 1969, the year the United States landed Apollo 11 on the moon, the year that's remembered as America's defining space victory, the Soviet Union still completed more total launches that year than the US did. 82 Soviet launches to America's 41. Soviet space activity didn't peak with a single moon landing. It peaked in 1982 with 108 launches in a single year. For decades, the USSR didn't just compete with American spaceflight. By sheer volume, it usually beat it. The Soviet program's achievements weren't limited to one headline. First satellite, 1957. First human in space, Yuri Gagarin, 1961. First woman in space. First spacewalk. Six orbital stations under the Salyut program, including the first ever built. Then, Mir, the first modular space station, growing to 7 pressurized sections, operating from 1986 to 2000. Then came 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. Russia inherited roughly 75% of Soviet space infrastructure by value, but also inherited the funding collapse that came with a disintegrating economy. Russian launch rates didn't decline gradually. They cratered from around 90 launches a year in the Soviet era to fewer than 17 a year for most of the period from 1995 to 2016. By 2016, Russia's entire annual space budget had shrunk to around $4 billion, less than Starlink alone now earns in a single year. That decline started in the 1990s. It's a structural trend 3 decades old, driven by the Soviet collapse, chronic underinvestment, and the rise of American commercial space. Not something that began with the war in Ukraine, but the war accelerated it through sanctions, isolation from international partnerships, and the diversion of resources toward the front line. By 2025, the picture had fully inverted from 1969. The United States completed a record 181 orbital launches that year. Russia completed 17. The country that once outpaced America in the original space race now launches at roughly a tenth of its rate. Not because the engineering knowledge disappeared, but because the money, the institutions, and the national priorities went somewhere else. These numbers don't settle the question of whether a war was justified or whether a space program is worth its price tag. That's not what numbers do. What they show is something simpler. Every government, every year makes a choice about where a finite pool of resources goes. Sometimes that choice builds something that outlives the people who funded it. A station that orbits for 14 years, a rocket design that flies for decades, a satellite network that still works long after the news cycle that covered its launch has been forgotten. And sometimes the same money disappears into a conflict that, regardless of outcome, mostly produces things that need to be rebuilt, recounted, and mourned. The Soviet Union once led the world into space on a fraction of what modern war costs. The capability didn't vanish. The choice about where to spend it did.